this session is about chapters 9 and 10, but I'm not going to be talking about chapter 9. I'm going to ask everybody to have a look at the podcast that Azul, Mama Maria, and Mama Maria created around zero waste. And so that we can hear from Mama Maria herself. And I did ask Mama Maria actually to be here today, but the internet where she is not working very well. And she said that she doesn't like Zoom. So I'm not going to put her through something that she doesn't feel comfortable with. But the podcast actually is incredible. And yeah, I invite you all to have a look at that. And so today is about chapter 10, which is the last chapter of the book. And I thought that the best way to go about it is to read a part of it and then to invite you to an exercise related to that chapter, but that's we're going to do on Google Drive, on Google Docs. So I'll start with the reading. And then in the second part, we're going to do that exercise. You're invited to do the exercise with me. This is the chapter called As Things Fall Apart. And the chapter starts with an exercise that invites you to go back to the warm-up exercise called Education 2048 and see what, if anything, has changed for you after reading the book in terms of responding to that exercise. But I'm not going to focus on that today. I'm going to focus on the text, the introductory text of that chapter. Okay, so after the end of the Second World War, for a period of time, the fulfillment of many of the promises of modernity seemed possible. The dreams of fair governance through rational democratic consensus, progress through science and technology, prosperity through economic growth and development, and the realization of ideals of universal human rights, basic healthcare, education, equity, and social mobility for all looked achievable and realistic. And I must admit that these things can sound appealing if we don't consider the means modernity uses to achieve these ends and the historical, relational, and ecological costs of these aspirations. However, when you look closer, not only is the picture much more complex, but the context we find ourselves in is very different from that of the period after the Second World War. Over the past 30 years, technology has changed our attention span and how we relate to knowledge. The way we selectively process fragments of information has limited our capacity to achieve functional consensus. Hyper-individualism has eroded our sense of the public good. Mass consumerism has deteriorated our willingness and capacity for being accountable and eroded our ability to discern between wants and needs. Our particular ideal of prosperity has led us to reach the limits of our planet's carrying capacity. Social media has unrestrained our vanity and taught us to like narcissism. We want to treat reality the same way we Photoshop our social media profiles. And when reality refuses to be selected, cropped, and edited out, we are left unequipped to deal with it. The single story of modernity is no longer tenable, which has led to a host of different outcomes, including an increased sense of anxiety regarding not only the fulfillment of modernity's promises, but also a general lack of certainty and guaranteed futurity. The end of modernity may not manifest primarily as economic or ecological collapse, but as a global mental health crisis, where the structures of modernity within us start to crumble. Because of the way modernity has socialized us to find security in certainty, stability, and predictability, as things fall apart, we will seek out ways to fulfill these desires. We will seek plastic intellectuality, plastic sensuality, plastic artistry. We will shop for plastic certainties that can be consumed in sound bites. We will binge on certainties that can take the bitterness away, give us comfort, lift our hearts, and keep us numb to the pain for a little longer. We will shop for packaged products wrapped in universal meanings, individual purpose, and hope in the future. They will promise to restore our sense of merit and virtue, of empowerment and agency, and of sovereignty and autonomy. In the supermarket of soundbite options, there are a variety of certainties to choose from, and you can mix and match as you please. There are certainties that come as text, an analysis, a framework, or formula through which we can script ourselves into something already written as a redemptive prophecy of history or progress. For example, critical theories, green views, donut economics, science, or the Bible. There are certainties that come as a projection placed upon a person or a group who are seen as more deserving, more heroic, wiser, or virtuous, and whose knowledge can rescue or liberate everyone. For example, the youth, elders, the most oppressed, experts, or even a populist leader. Certainties can be packaged as universal solutions or practices, such as a project, a technique, a methodology, or a form of discipline that can heal or fix what's broken and restore innocence and purity, like technotopias, organic farming, westernized yoga, psychedelics, meditation, the self-care industry, prayer, or protest. Certainties can also be placed upon a notion of time, space, or origin, where things were or will be in order in the past or in the future, before or after capitalism, colonialism, slavery, postmodernity, modernity, neoliberalism, culture wars, the pandemic, or even Western civilization. As things fall apart, for a window of time, some who have been at the margins will have a chance to experience a plastic form of redress, as people will seek out their knowledge, but only to consume it. This consumption of marginalized knowledge is driven by the search for answers for how to either reform modernity or build a prefabricated alternative to it. When this happens, it will be very tempting to feel that finally the oppressors will be proven wrong because our knowledge is right and we knew it all along. However, customers will only buy what's convenient and what comes cheap without major efforts or substantial changes. Genuine teachings will be distorted by this market, both for sellers and customers, and the truth in it will be dissolved without people even noticing it. A lot of time and energy will be wasted there. Beyond the fact that these marginalized knowledges will be selectively consumed, it's also important to note that not everything at the margins offers something new or something generative. Before anything different can happen, before people can sense, hear, relate, and imagine differently, there must be a clearing, a decluttering, an initiation into the unknowable, and a letting go of the desires for certainty, authority, hierarchy, of insatiable consumption as a mode of relating to everything. We will need a genuine severance that will shatter all projections, anticipations, hopes, and expectations in order to find something we lost about ourselves, about time and space, about the depth of the shit we're in, about the medicines and poisons that we carry. This is about pain, about death, about finding a compass, an antidote to separability. This is about being ready to go, to befriend death, before we're ready to return home and to live as grown-ups. But this is not easy because modernity has programmed us not to choose this direction. Even once we decide we want to change, we are conditioned to want change to happen quickly and on our own terms, generally terms that do not jeopardize our perceived entitlements, our securities, and our self-images. In this context, our visions of change are based on simplistic analysis and solutions, paternalistic relationships with marginalized communities, and ethnocentric ideals of justice, sustainability, and change. We underestimate the depth and complexity of problems, and we overestimate what information, policies, protocols, and enthusiasm can do. We also miscalculate the gap between where we are at and where we would like to be, and what we would need to relinquish to get there. We tend to project and universalize our expectations of means, outcomes, and outputs. And when different expectations clash, we get upset and frustrated. We do not have the stamina or resilience to keep going when the going gets tough. We enter debates to win, using more high ground, self-righteousness, or even self-blame to recenter ourselves in the competition for platform and for the power to continue to define the direction of the process. When this happens, the claim of awareness of oppression can become a claim to innocence that recenters the needs, entitlements, and investments of those who are claiming it. Picture a large group of obnoxious children who throw a temper tantrum every time their unrealistic expectations and demands are not met. Now multiply it by a couple of billion. This is us. We may even say we want to learn from discomfort or from uncertainty, but when it actually happens, when we experience pain and vulnerability, we fight to regain comfort and control. We have been taught to seek consensus and validation. And when this is not possible, we become frustrated and don't know what to do. We tend to overlook the complexities and paradoxes in our contexts, as well as our own contradictions. We tend to polarize, to antagonize, to vilify, to victimize, to idealize, and to romanticize. We tend to look for a moral space beyond critique for ourselves and those with whom we identify. In this context of mistrust, struggle for power, and protection of perceived entitlements, it's difficult to disagree without hurting each other. And since vulnerabilities are not evenly distributed, we should remember that people who are at the receiving end of systemic violence are again made responsible for a heavier load of work in spaces where difficult learning happens. So where do we go from here? Facing the magnitude of the task of enabling a world without separability between us and the land and each other requires more than a change of narratives, convictions, or identities. It also requires more than a mere intention to change. It requires an interruption of harmful desires hidden behind promises of entitlements and securities that people hold on to, particularly when they are desperate or afraid. Imagine that separability is a broken limb with pieces of bone left unconnected for a long time, topped with an infected wound. Imagine that in order to heal it, instead of rejoining the bones, we simply put a band-aid on the wound and cast around the limb, and we take powerful sedatives to get rid of the pain. Imagine the band-aids are colorful, hopeful, and make us feel like everything is going to be okay. The plaster cast makes the limb look functional. It's culturally sensitive, artistically crafted, and signed by everyone to give us a warm feeling of community and care. The sedative numbing the acute chronic pain helps us to escape into the bliss of avoidance, denial, and delirious and delicious distractions. But none of this offers the healing necessary to reconnect the bones. Genuine rehabilitation would require something completely different. First, we would need to cut the cast open to expose what's hidden underneath. We would then need to rip off the band-aids with a mass of glue, hair, and pus, cut away the rotten flesh to stop the infection, and disinfect the wound. Next, we would need to saw the tips of each bone to remove any calcification so that they can be rejoined together again. Lastly, which is perhaps the most difficult part, we would need to withdraw safely from the numbing sedatives we have become addicted to. No wonder this is a difficult sell, but do we really have another option? If we don't heal the limb properly, the infection will compromise the whole metabolism. So this chapter offers frameworks and images using the GTDF collective that articulate both the necessity and the difficulties of this healing work, of both hospicing modernity and holding space for something new, undefined, and potentially, but not necessarily, wiser. I'll just jump now to the part about the tightrope and learning to walk the tightrope, which is just a little bit down. So imagine that the tightrope is placed over a precarious net of desperate hope, which hangs over an abyss of desperate hopelessness. Desperate hope is hope that modernity can be rescued by the right ideology, a heroic authority, the chosen people, an extraordinary practice, or a messianic return to where the good, the true, and the beautiful have not been corrupted. Desperate hopelessness spells nihilism, misanthropy, hedonism, absolute relativism, or which I call here whateverism, and the banalization of brutality. Balance on a tightrope is not easy to achieve because of its oscillations and lack of predictability and absolute certainties. Staying still for a long time is also not an option. You need to move. On this tightrope in particular, you must walk with honesty, humility, humor, and hyper self-reflexivity in order not to fall from it. Walking with honesty is about choosing reality over fantasy and facing the shadows, the storms, and the shit. Walking with humility is about de-idealizing humanity so that we can see it in its full complexity, the good, the bad, the beautiful, the ugly, the broken, and the messed up, within ourselves and around us. Walking with humor is about disinvesting from economies of sternness and superiority, keeping all the absurdities in view, and being able to laugh at ourselves and with others as we start to see that we're both cute and pathetic characters in this cosmic plot. Walking with hyper self-reflexivity is what can help us to develop discernment, remain sober, choose maturity, and manifest responsibility before will. As you walk the tightrope, you carry a rod in your hands to help you balance. This rod has intellectual rigor on one side and relational rigor on the other. Steadiness and stability should help you to start to develop relationships grounded on trust, respect, reciprocity, consent, and accountability. So I'll stop here and say that the rest of the chapter is trying to show other frameworks of the GTDF collective, but also inviting people to think about the GTDF collective differently. So one of the things we have created that's still in draft form is a disclaimer, gesturing towards the Colonial Futures disclaimer. And this came as we received lots of questions about the collective. Actually, it came way before the Hospicing modernity sessions, but I think it's consolidating with the kinds of engagements we are finding during the session, the series as well. So what I'll do is I'll ask Azul, can you put the link to the Google Doc of the disclaimer on the chat? I'll invite those of you who want to come with me to the Google Doc. I will read the Google Doc, but I will ask you to comment, because it is a link where you can comment as well, to comment on the document as we go through it together. And I think it is a good place to finish the series, because it tries to consolidate what we see our collective to be doing and to be offering, and what it's not offering as well, which you try to put also in the book. So I will try to just share my Google Doc here. Okay, here we go. So in the disclaimer, we say that GTDF is at the same time a collective, a mode of inquiry, a practice of experimentation, and a living entity. GTDF is a collective of people who feel called to work together, and then people are already changing the text, around a set of political, relational, ecological, economic, social, and existential, complex and wicked global challenges, and who make their work public through Creative Commons. So Creative Commons, the best way to just explain it is that it's copyleft rather than copyright. GTDF is a mode of inquiry about different possibilities for coexistence at the interface of two sets of questions. Questions related to the historical and systemic harm that have enabled and that sustain our current systems, identities, and privileges, and questions related to the unsustainability and breakdown of our current habits of existence. GTDF can also be described as a practice of self-experimentation in context of exponential VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, marked by the impossibility of stable authorities, permanent vocabularies, and consensus on the common good. GTDF is also a living entity with its own integrity, vibe, and dance moves. And as with other living entities, its physical existence will experience birth, youth, maturity, decline, obsolescence, and eventual death. It seeks to leave no formal legacy. It's not a brand, and it does not want to be remembered in the future. But it aspires to enable the possibility for different possibilities to become even possible, as a form of service and accountability to human and non-human generations in the continuum of life. Since the challenges we face are hyper-complex and unprecedented, GTDF recognizes that the relevance of any particular intervention in reality is bound by time, place, and context. In general, those who find GTDF experiments, maps, and exercises useful are experiencing one or more of the following in relationship to complexity and uncertainty in their time, place, and context. They are either experiencing so first, they are uninspired, treading water in contexts where the strategies, identity formations, and solutions that worked before no longer work. Or they are exhausted, trying to stay afloat in the pit, having to deal with unprecedented and overwhelming complex issues that they don't feel well equipped for. 3, they are distressed, already drowning in the pit, and facing breakdowns and crises in highly charged contexts, and usually considering major life changes as a way to exit the agony. So in this context, people have found that the exercises, mode of inquiry, and of practice of experimentation of the collective has helped them to do a number of things. So here is where I ask, if you see anything, or if anything comes up on your bus that is not listed here, please help us and put more things in the list. So we hear from people that the exercises help them sit with reality differently without wanting to run away, to face uncertainty differently without wanting uncertainty to go away, see differently and see different things, accept the gifts of discomfort, mistakes, and failures, relate differently to pain, loss, and death, build stamina for the permanent work of facing shadows, storms, and shit, articulate and hold space for paradoxes, internal and external to themselves, expand their bandwidth, and be more open to risk-taking experimentation. Start the long process of building relations based on trust, respect, reciprocity, consent, and accountability, understanding that this will have different meanings in different contexts. Exercise responsibility and accountability from a different space. Serve as a better translator between different contexts, struggles, and generations. And there's a whole project now around translation that is super interesting as well. Embrace the process of aging and eldering. Find different sources of vitality and inspiration. And what's coming up there is honoring complexities, personal and collective, probably complexities. GTDF as a collective, mode of inquiry, practice, or entity does not claim to have universal answers or answers, period. We're not seeking hegemony, which is about offering a universally applicable or more woke, more high ground. We're not trying to describe realities, but to reflect collectively on inquiries, experiments that are context, place, and time bound. People who feel they have the answers either do not like what we're doing, they see it as a competition for hegemony or for markets, or worse, they pick and choose what resonates with their answers and repackage the exercises as part of their brand, which sometimes it's even okay. We offer maps, tools, experiments that may or may not work in your context. And please read this last sentence again. If you're trying to change a tire, you won't have much use for a shovel. And if composting shit is what you need to do, a car jack won't serve you either. So these maps, tools, and experiments to invite people to create a space or container that is neither about self-celebration, that's it, for example, pride, empowerment, or narrative validation, nor self-flagellation, guilt, shame, or humiliation, but a space where we can have an honest look at our own idealizations of self, others, and the world, our projections of what should or shouldn't be, our illusions and delusions, our socially imposed and self-made illusions and delusions, so that we can reactivate exiled collective capacities to do three different things. Number one, to sit together with the difficult and painful aspects of what presents itself, the good, the bad, the ugly, the broken, and the messed up, within and around, without turning away. To be with the reality that presents itself in all its complexity and unknowability, without attempting to trap it in meaning, to contain it, or to run from it. To learn to navigate what presents itself with the colonial manifestations of sobriety, maturity, discernment, and responsibility through honesty, humility, humor, and hyper self-reflexivity in that tightrope. And here, I think we were thinking about including a caveat. And the caveat is that we need to acknowledge that self-celebration has been an effective dialectical response to different forms of subjugation and humiliation. It has provided a source of kinship, belonging, community, meaning, strength, and well-being in many struggles, and it has saved many lives. And it's also unsustainable in the current context and in becoming increasingly ineffective as a means to access pleasure and satisfaction, or a sense of belonging and collectivity. So within current political economies, as we approach VUCA tipping points, these things start to become less and less effective. So the same tipping points are also rendering ineffective the use of guilt, shame, and humiliation to mobilize change. Moral high grounds and avant-garde identities are very limited political and existential investments in chaotic, cacophonic, competitive environments where oppression is used as a currency and mobilized to expand often colonial entitlements. And this is causing a lot of grief for those making these investments. So the bottom line is, in order to enable the very possibility of a different mode of coexistence to become even possible as a seed, the satisfactions we have with the current mode of existence need to be interrupted by something external or internal to the self and hospiced. A smart move is to learn to identify and let go of our excuses willingly while we still have the choice. So here I mean exercise unconditional cooperation with the inevitable. The end of the world as we know it is already here, breathing down our necks, and so is the possibility of something different, possibly wiser, if we can compost our shit and create the soil that is necessary for it to sprout and to grow. For now, the seeds are mostly falling onto paved roads, and sometimes cracks in these roads as well. If you feel tending to these seeds is the work you need to do, even though it mostly fails, then this work may be useful for you. And with that, I'm going to put here on the chat the questions that you're invited to engage with in your breakout room. So I'll just find them over here. The first question is, so what, now what? What, if anything, has shifted on your bus in relationship to how you relate to your thoughts, to your body, to the complexity of your own being, to the complexity of your context, to pain, to grief, to loss, and to death, to life, to joy and compassion, and to the invitation of digging deeper and relating wider that is issued through the book. So first question, can you talk about the role of erratic forces in the healing process of our relating to the earth that you mentioned through the book? Yes, a little bit. I don't think we'll have time to go very deep into it today, but part of the healing that needs to happen is both a cognitive healing, affective healing, relational healing, economic healing, and metabolic healing, which could be seen as ecological, which is recalibrating our bodies so that we can activate these exiled capacities, but also remove the charges and the commodification of the forces that are already in the body that have been commodified by modernity. And that the erotic forces under sexuality have been charged with a lot of symbolisms and not a lot of narratives and values as commodities too, as our sexuality becomes a commodity that need to be undone so that we can develop the kinds of intimacies, not only within the metabolisms that we inhabit in our physical bodies, but also beyond the boundaries of this physical body in time and temporality with the rest of the planet, with other people, with the other species, and with the land itself. And this is hard work that is not that requires discipline. So in our collective, the work that is related to the erotic is usually done in tandem with the teachings that we have in the discipline that we have to develop to work with sacred plants with the indigenous community. So it's the same kind of respect and reverence for the forces that are there, both in the plants and in the erotic of both our bodies and the land. And they require the same level of effort and discipline for us to decommodify and relate to it from a very different space. So there is a text about sacred medicines that I think hasn't been mentioned here that could be important in that kind of work, which is called A Call for Accountability in Plant Medicine Work. But I think in that text, there are lots of parallels and resonances with the work that needs to be done with both individual and collective erotic and land-based erotic forces as well. So I'll include that in the email that goes to everybody at the end of the week. Sorry. Yeah, today my bus is very, it's not distracted, but it's going in parallel ways. Yesterday I had a traumatic experience of profiling in a store, and I think I'm still processing that. So today I am unsettled, I think, because of that. So I do apologize if I am operating in that vibe. I will need space to process that. So, Ella, do you think the current schooling system can be reformed to support development of metabolic literacies, or is it beyond reform? Is beyond reform eventually the only option? So here, I think there is a part of the book in chapter 10 that talks about the difference between divestment and disinvestment. Divestment is just kind of, it's the beyond reform space and saying, okay, this is done, I'm walking away. And you turn your back and you do something else and try to create an alternative. And disinvestment is different. You stay with it. And it's much more associated then with hospicing and hacking. I believe that if we think about disinvestment, because disinvestment, it's disinvestment in the futurity of it, or disinvestment in the harmful investments associated with it, it's still very important to stay with the schooling system, in the deschooling movement, in the alternative schooling movement, to see how modernity ends up being reproduced in all of this, and stay with the trouble, stay with the storm. And try to steer things in different ways and do your experiments. If we're looking for a position that is either beyond critique or that is position of innocence or virtue or purity, then this work of hospicing becomes very complicated, because that doesn't give you that, can't give you that. But if we understand, for example, even critique in a more layered way, and what we can do at the decision-making table of institutions that are dying, then the range of possibilities for action really changes. So again, in this case, I think there's a text that has just been published by Sharon on the website about a cartography of critiques that could help with that question, about where you want to position yourself in relationship to the schooling system, if it's disinvestment or divestment, that gives you the range of possibilities of what you can do to move things in a different direction. So I will also include that in the email that will be sent on Saturday. It's a very good cartography about people who are outside of the table, who really need to offer barking critiques of the system, saying there's no point, that then help people who are at the edge of the table, who are growling people, like kind of refusing to be at the table but still at the edge. Then there are stompers, people who are offering stomping critiques at the table, saying we're not moving unless you hear the people who are offering barking critiques and growling critiques. And then there are the steerers, people who are closer to the ears of those who can actually make it possible to change, and all the translation that needs to happen between one critique and the other. That is an overview of that is in that text, but we put a disclaimer also in the beginning of the text, saying that this is one of the texts that has been in the back burner for a long time. Like, we've been talking about this cartography for a long time, and we don't know if it's ready. So you have to, when you go to the text, you might need to cook it a little bit more or to put some spices in. And we may need to tell you that it can give you stomachache if you just eat it raw. So just go to the text with more care in that case. Then there is Claude's question, reviewing to the future is troubling given the current situation in Ukraine. How can we further respond to the situation and similar conflicts at this time? Extremely important question. We are going to be talking more about that in the pedagogy session. But what I can offer right now is that we need to figure out a way to layer the ways that we engage with this conflict. So, for example, we're seeing a lot of the dialectical movement between like romanticizing one empire over and vilifying another. So it's either you've romanticized the Western Empire and vilify the Russian Empire, or you romanticize the Russian Empire and vilify the Western Empire. And maybe lose perspective that empires are the problem. And this layering is also needed in terms of our relationality in relationship to how we manifest solidarity, because solidarity right now too is very attached to an idea of a deserving an idealized victim, whereas we need to figure out a way of enacting solidarity that doesn't romanticize or idealize anybody or the struggle itself. Otherwise, it's always a transactional thing that is in the end unsustainable, because the complexities of identities and struggles are going to surface much more at this time than they have in the past. And if our solidarity is based on the idealization, the solidarity cannot be sustained when faced, if it's faced with complexities and paradoxes and contradictions. So the idea of deservedness is very much attached to that, but we will be talking about that more in our pedagogy session. So it's the basic thing, I think, is to be able to hold all that is happening from a different space, and hold the space on your bus for what's difficult and uncomfortable without feeling overwhelmed or immobilized by that. Next question. Can you talk on how you've composted the shit that accumulates from taking people from different parts of the modernized world to Indigenous communities? Yes, but there's also a text about that that maybe is easier. So in the book that Cash wrote, towards scarring our collective soul wound, you will find a chapter, I think it's chapter 3 or 4, about the pedagogy that we used to take people to witness a Sundance ceremony in the Kainai Reserve in Alberta. So there you will find a little bit of story of how it happened, but there are 4 things we talk about there. I think we talked about these things in one of the sessions, probably session 2. But the idea of asking people to interrupt their sense of entitlement, interrupt their over intellectualization, to be able to be present to something that is going to be challenging, but also inviting at the same time, and difficult, because it involves catharsis and emotional processing that people are not used to. These things are all described there. So I'll also put that resource there. And the last question, have you found many others who report feeling undone and unmoored as a result of reading this book? Suggestions for how to best navigate this wondrous space? This is the reason why we're having the sessions. We are trying to do due diligence of, like, as if we're opening up the cans of worms, we need to put the worms back in the land. There's a responsibility if you're inviting people into this process, right? So we're trying what we can, and we're open to suggestions too, in terms of helping people process, find community, and continue the work in their context. We know that once you start to break some of the stories that have secured the continuity of modernity it is in a very discombobulating space, and it helps heaps if you have a few people around you. You don't have to have this is not a movement of millions. You need probably 5 people that can have a similar vocabulary and that have the heart to do the work with the shadow, the shit, and the storm with you, and then figure out a way that you can keep each other on task, because it's super easy to get distracted, and then help each other develop the discipline that that is needed for that kind of work with rigor, right? With intellectual and relational rigor. So I think I'll stop there. The other questions, remember, that are going to be archived. We're going to be looking at them. I will now share another text called Co-Sensing with Radical Tenderness. And I'll just ask, Dani, can you say hello?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm sorry I have to keep the mask on because of just collective care here right now. But I am really pleased to have had this time with you all, and I'm really feeling also honored that we can close these few sessions that we had with this text, which has helped us in the collective move a lot of precisely also these emotions that we were talking about in the last question, of sitting with the questions that this book raises. So yeah, Vane can talk you through how we chose to offer this text right now, and here we are for this closure together.
Thank you, Dani. So the invitation is to do a cacophonic exercise where we're going to read the text together, and it doesn't have to be in unison. It can be with echoes of different voices. So the individual invitation is that if a sentence calls for you to read it, you just unmute yourself and you read it. We will have to find collectively a rhythm for it to flow, but there could be echoes, and that's perfectly fine. And if more than one person reads the same sentence, that's okay. That's the point of the exercise, to have many voices, but not necessarily synchronized reading everything. And then at the end, we'll see how it feels. So you're invited to unmute if you feel you need to read a sentence. And I will start. Co-sense with radical tenderness and accept its invitation to be present. Tune in with the collective body, both human and non-human.
Take notice of all the skins and places we inhabit, the bones and lands that bear our weight.
Feel your entanglement with everything, including the ugly and the messed up.
Broken and the messed up.
Relate beyond desires for coherence, purity, and perfection.
Feel your entanglement with everything.
Interrupt addictions to consumption, not only of stuff, but also of knowledge, experiences, and relationships.
Let go of possessions.
Let go of identification,
fantasies of comprehension.
beyond what you like and dislike.
Follow non-normative and non-linear time.
Deactivate your cravings for protagonism, greatness, and legacy.
For pleasure.
Stop fearing fear, uncertainty, and emptiness.
Fear, uncertainty, and emptiness.
Stop fearing fear, uncertainty, and
disillusionment.
Open to the gifts of
disillusionment and dissolution.
Thunder without collapse.
Space for the unknown, the invisible in ourselves and in others.
Ourselves and in others.
Sense rather than meaningfulness. Allow your
state
without also
open, but always trapped in an
Don't hold being hostage to knowing. Engage with
By
creativity
holding
beyond
hostage
intellect.
knowing.
Exile capacities, expand
Just
sensibilities.
the ways in which our
Open
thoughts
to
and
what you
emotions,
Intimacy.
biophysical
non-human on the earth
Ways in which our
about our
emotions
relationship.
are
conclusions.
listen to non-linear care about
What you may never
Cement
be
yourself.
open to what you can understand. Don't cast upon everything a blanket vigilance.
Yourself.
Noises preventing you from digging deeper
Be
and
receptive to
wiser
others.
Don't cast upon everything a blanket of interpretation. Silence
Simplicity and violence.
Look for validation.
Superiority
Be
and
receptive to
Let
the
go of your
teachings of
fear
the
of
shadows.
Violence and
Or
superiority and personal
Embrace yourself.
From mistakes.
Encourage us to be vulnerable.
being less
validation.
being more
less
Peace yourself.
for validation.
Empathetic.
Let us have each other's back.
Sense of
Give them
radical
back each other up.
Tune in rather than is a difference. Notice how you move
For new forms of
comfort
comfort,
tension.
down,
Stability back rather than back.
Increase care in proportion to risk.
Remember,
with humility,
Humility,
generosity, and reverence.
reverence.
Notice how you move between your toes.
How you move between your comfort, allowing others to move through and for you. Turn the heart
into a verb.
The painful
Rosanat,
pangs of love
Bensa.
of really wanting to see.
feel the pain of the earth.
Likewise, your arm.
Being in several layers.
Understand that the earth is not extension of our bodies, it's all around.
There me nor you.
Being either
Learn to breathe water, see water.
In the womb, created when the skin holding one body stretches and tears in order to receive and
Allow
be
yourself to
refigured by
be
another.
guided by a metabolic intelligence.
And
Practice engage
and
back.
All sense with radical tenderness and practice
Evoke and evoke.
offer palliative care to the disabled world that is dying.
Assist with the birth of something new.
Forever
Digest the
changeable
teachings.
and fluid.
Reciprocating what has been born.
Be water.
With
Projections and
radical
idealizations.
Assist with the birth of something new without suffocating what is being born with projections and idealizations.
Digest the teaching.
Tone sense with radical tenderness.
Allow it to come through you.
Allow it
Forever
to come
changeable
through
and
you.
fluid.
Forever
Political
changeable and
practice.
Open and evoke in a double and simultaneous movement, manifestation of a political practice of healing and well-being that is beyond what human intelligence can fathom. Allow it to come through you, forever changeable and fluid.
allow it to
Allow it.
through you.
Allow it to come through you.
Changeable and fluid.
Allow it to come through you. Forever changeable and fluid.
Thank you.
Lots of voices on a much bigger bus.
So I invite everybody to put your view in gallery mode so that we can see everybody. And I hope to see you in the next 2 sessions. Remember, next week we don't have any, but then there's 2 more, one on pedagogy, on decolonization. I have invited the people who are going to be facilitating facing human wrongs to do the session on pedagogy with me, and then decolonization. I'm still gathering the team together. I hope to have Elwood Jimmy also there with me, who was the author of some of the books as well, and Cash. And I think we could use this time to see if we can, if there's anything more that you feel needs to be said before we say goodbye. This is the end, the official end of the Hospicing Modernity series. I hope that the book can support some of our work through the storms together. We will be again contacting you for the smaller group sessions once we have had a chance to look at the survey. There are around 200 people registered in the survey, so just bear with us. It may take a little while for us to go through everything and then find out the groups, but we're aiming for groups at the end of April, beginning of May, and then some over the summer for support for this kind of work. And they are much more networking groups, so we will be there in the beginning and then we'll leave the room so that you can have your own conversations. Also because there are many groups, it's too many people. Yeah, so the mic is open. If in the chat, I think I'm gonna open as well for everybody. Yeah, in the chat is also open. And for those who are not coming for the pedagogy and the decolonization session, this is goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Vanessa.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Oh, Vanessa. Vanessa, thank you. Obrigado. Obrigado. Thank you. For everything.